Hi, I'm Camille, and I was told, right to my face, you're nothing without this family. Then they locked me out of the estate my husband built, sold off my studio, erased my name from our legacy like I was never there. But silence doesn't mean surrender. They thought I'd fade, but what I built next, they'll never be allowed to touch. Want to know how far betrayal goes before a woman fights back? The invitation came tucked inside a cream envelope with gold edges. Brielle's handwriting looked like it belonged on a wedding invite, not a casual family dinner. She called it a celebration of family unity. That was her phrasing, polished, hollow, and slick like everything else she touched. Daniel handed it to me without looking up from his phone. "She really wants you to be there, Mom," he said. I studied his face for a trace of irony, something to suggest he understood the undercurrent, but there was nothing, just the flat tone of a man used to translating someone else's words. I nodded, smiled politely, and placed the card on my kitchen counter, beside the pill organizer and my reading glasses. I'd spent years hosting birthdays, Thanksgivings, every single Christmas. I made it work on a single income and a tired heart. But now, I was just a name on a guest list she controlled. Suburban Virginia wore its autumn colors like a fading photograph. As I pulled up to their house, the sky was streaked with that soft orange that makes you nostalgic even when nothing's really changed. I parked 2 houses down, even though the driveway was empty. Old habits. The bread sat warm in the passenger seat, a crusty rosemary loaf I'd baked that morning. I walked up the stone path and rang the bell. Brielle opened the door in a navy sheath dress. Her makeup was flawless. "Camille, you're early." She glanced down at the loaf. "That's sweet, but we already have catering. Mom." The way she said "Mom" had a layer to it, like a trophy, not a relationship. The house was spotless, minimalist decor, marble countertops, and furniture that looked too expensive to sit on. A portrait of their family hung above the mantel, Daniel, Brielle, and the kids. I wasn't in it. I placed the bread on the sideboard. It looked out of place. I'd worn a simple gray cardigan, pearls, and slacks. Everyone else wore cocktail attire, tailored dresses, silk ties. I overheard one of Brielle's friends laugh softly. These old school women, bless them, still think casseroles and good intentions build legacy. I smiled, just slightly. Dignity costs nothing. And it's the one currency I still carried. We sat down to dinner under a chandelier I'm sure cost more than my entire living room. The table was long, the kind you'd see in a magazine spread called Modern Elegance. Brielle stood up mid-meal, lifted her glass, and tapped it with a fork. "This family," she said, "was built on innovation, not old habits. And tonight, we celebrate forward thinking, building a legacy for tomorrow." Applause followed, some genuine, some just didn't want to be the one not clapping. I stared at my water glass. Then came the slideshow. Photos of the kids, Daniel's new business venture, charity events, vacations, perfect angles, perfect lighting. There was one shot of my late husband, smiling in the backyard with the kids. They called it the foundation. No one said my name. Daniel didn't meet my eyes. I felt the room blur slightly, like someone had lowered the volume. There I was, present, but edited out, like a placeholder now erased. Dinner ended, plates cleared. I stood to help, collecting a few wine glasses. Brielle leaned in as we crossed in the kitchen. "You're nothing without this family," she whispered, with the warmth of someone commenting on the weather. "Remember that." She smiled and turned away. I didn't move, didn't flinch. My pulse didn't quicken like it used to when someone struck below the belt. No, something else happened. My breath slowed. My feet grounded. There was no room for drama, just calculation. She thought I needed them, needed to be seen. But I'd built the very bones of that house. I'd packed lunchboxes, paid tuition, sat in hospital waiting rooms alone. She was playing chess on a board I carved. I didn't say a word, but I placed the remaining bread on the center of the table as I left, a quiet offering turned symbol. No one noticed. Outside, the air had turned crisp. Leaves fell in lazy circles around my feet. I paused on the sidewalk, looking back at that house. Once, it echoed with my laughter, my recipes, my Christmas music on too early in November. Now, it was hollow perfection. Funny how you can spend. The silence the next morning wasn't peaceful. It wasn't the kind of quiet that invites reflection. It was the kind that presses on your chest and dares you to breathe. I sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, hands in my lap, waiting for something to happen. A text from Daniel, a voicemail, anything. But the phone stayed still, cold glass and silence. I made coffee. The sound of the machine sputtering filled the kitchen like an old man trying to clear his throat. I tidied up out of habit, straightened the fruit bowl, wiped down the counter that didn't need it. The bread from the night before still sat wrapped in foil by the sink, untouched. I didn't throw it away, not yet. For years, my role was clear. I showed up, smiled, blended in. I was the backdrop. And now, even that had been taken. It didn't make me angry, yet. It made me sharp. They removed me from the story. Maybe it's time I write my own. I pulled open the drawer under the old desk in the hallway. The wood creaked like it remembered. Inside, buried beneath expired coupons and a dried-out pen, was the journal. Worn leather, corners frayed. I opened to a blank page and wrote, "This is not a diary. This is evidence." A chill moved through me, not from fear, but clarity. By late morning, I found myself standing at the attic ladder. I hadn't been up there since David died. The light bulb at the top flickered as I climbed, each step groaning under weight both physical and otherwise. The air smelled like dust and old Christmas, boxes everywhere, labeled in my handwriting. Kitchen. Dan's room. Wedding. I paused on that one, but didn't open it. Not yet. Near the back, I found a smaller box, taped neatly but aged. Inside was a tape recorder, the kind with the little built-in mic and the red button. I pressed play, expecting static. Instead, his voice. "You always said this land would grow in value. I thought you were just being cautious, but you were right, Camille." "You were right about everything." David, 1995. I sat there for minutes, letting it play, letting him remind me of the woman I used to be. Measured, calculating, not loud, but precise. I kept digging, found receipts, handwritten ledgers, my name signed under the first loan, land survey documents. I had forgotten how involved I was at the start, how central. And then I remembered. I signed the deed to that first piece of property in my name. Not his, not the company's, mine. The call came as I was boxing things back up. My niece, Elora. "Aunt Cam, sorry, I know it's random, but I was doing some land title pulls this week and your name popped up on something in Henrico County. Thought you'd sold that land years ago?" My throat dried. "No, sweetheart. I don't think I ever did." "Well," she said, casual but careful, "then you might want to take a second look. That parcel sits under what's now the Danielle complex. If your name's still on those records, you might be holding more cards than they want you to believe." I leaned against the wall, the phone warm in my hand. "I don't know what they told you, Aunt Cam," she added, "but your name's not just history, it's leverage." When we hung up, I didn't move for a while. Then I went back down the ladder. The sunlight through the hallway window had shifted, painting long lines on the floor. I stopped in front of the photo wall. My face was gone, replaced by Brielle's curated perfection. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened my laptop, created a folder, named it Empire. I began dragging files in, scanned letters, bank records, old voice memos. Everything that proved my fingerprints were on the foundation of what they now paraded around as their own. People think building an empire means power. I think it means remembering who the architect was in the first place. Before closing the last box, something fluttered loose, a handkerchief. Faded white with small blue kites stitched in uneven thread. Junie made it when she was 8. I almost tossed it into the donation pile, but then I folded it carefully and tucked it into the journal. Even the wind has its purpose. Late afternoon sunlight cut across the rug in the living room, stretching long shadows toward my feet. I was folding a dish towel when the doorbell rang. 2 short bursts, not neighborly, not casual. I glanced through the curtain. Daniel and Brielle. I opened the door. Didn't expect to see you both today. Daniel gave me that half smile he used when he didn't want to explain too much. Hey, Mom. Mind if we come in? I stepped aside. Brielle entered like she owned the air between us. We just thought we'd check in. Heard from a few folks that you haven't been yourself lately. I watched her, calmly. Folks? She sat. Well, just some chatter from the office. You've been asking about old property deeds, stirring up the past. We were a little concerned. Daniel shifted in his seat, already regretting the visit. It's nothing, Mom. Just want to make sure everything's all right. I've been sorting paperwork, I said, because I realized how much of it I never got to keep. Oh, funny. How easy it is to disappear from your own life on paper. Brielle's voice tightened just a hair. Elora showed you the land records, didn't she? There it was. I set down the towel, sat across from them, and said evenly, You always taught me to stay in my place. But what if my place owns the land your house is built on? Daniel's jaw moved, but no words came. Brielle smirked without humor. Let's not make this adversarial. Who's making it adversarial? I asked. You came to my door. They didn't stay much longer. Brielle stood first. Daniel muttered something about calling me later. They left in silence, walking a little faster than when they'd arrived. An hour later, I met Elora at a quiet cafe just off Granby Street. She had a folder in front of her, thick and worn. Founding contracts, she said, sliding it across the table. My name stared up at me from the deed, still listed as co-owner. I flipped further. There was my signature on the original incorporation forms, long before David's name ever touched them. You were the initial financier, Elora said. Technically, you still hold veto power on any major decisions. Brielle's been acting like she runs the place, but you're still at the foundation. I stared at the ink. I remembered that day, signing the paperwork, letting David handle the public side while I backed it quietly. I whispered, What would he say now? Elora touched my hand. Don't think of this as war. Think of it as reclaim. The email came that evening. Subject line, board review, expansion proposal. Sent from Brielle's assistant, but signed with her name. Polite on the surface, clipped underneath. I knew what it was. A test. Maybe even a show. The meeting was scheduled for 6:00 p.m. inside the company's new boardroom. Polished stone table, chrome fixtures, light too white to feel natural. I walked in, carrying my laptop and a folder of prepared notes, only to find no one looking my way. Just brief nods, eyes back to phones. Brielle sat at the head, Rhett beside her, Silas further down. A few unfamiliar faces, external board members brought in over the past year. No welcome, no small talk. Just a thin printed agenda left at each seat. I read it once. Then again, my presentation wasn't listed, just one item under my name, Signature Authorization Review. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a discussion. This was a formality. Or worse, an ambush dressed in protocol. Brielle opened the meeting, thanking everyone for attending, her voice steady and measured. Due to time constraints, she said partway through, we'll be skipping Mrs. May Thorne's prepared remarks for today's session. I looked up. Calm face. Flat voice. My hand rested on my laptop, still closed. Silas shifted in his chair but didn't speak. Rhett looked confused, then annoyed, but he didn't push either. The others just moved on like nothing had happened. They presented slides, projections, maps, lease expansions, words I'd helped shape 2 months ago, now spilling from other mouths without a nod in my direction. I said nothing, but inside, something was waking up. They talked over each other, polished, prepared, like they'd practiced the rhythm in advance. Meanwhile, I sat with my notes untouched. Then, without warning, Brielle introduced an operational amendment, said it was aimed at streamlining board participation. Only members under 65 would be allowed to vote on capital expansion decisions moving forward. The words were so clean, so neutral sounding. They stung sharper. I didn't speak. I didn't blink. I just stared at her. Brielle avoided my eyes. Silas looked down. Rhett leaned forward, voice low. That's not standard. Where's this coming from? We reviewed it with legal. Brielle cut him off. It aligns with progressive governance models. Rhett leaned back, visibly biting his tongue. And me? I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even leave. I just sat there. Let them make their little show. Every moment etched into memory, every word filed away. After the meeting ended, I asked Silas to stay behind. In the hallway, I spoke softly. I need you to look into the legality of that amendment. He nodded, hesitant. I will. I didn't expect that tonight. Dinner sat on the small kitchen table under the soft overhead light. One plate, one glass, one fork. Every sound, clink of silverware, scrape of dish, felt too loud in an empty room. I poured tea, took a sip, and let the silence carry me back to the boardroom. Their faces, the amendment, my exclusion, so elegantly disguised. I whispered his name, almost embarrassed. David. The sound seemed to echo in the stillness. For years I believed silence preserved peace. Now I saw that silence builds dams you by hiding what's true, locking in what's wrong. I stared at the untouched bread I'd baked earlier. It sat wrapped, a gesture that had once meant love. Now it felt like a relic. I turned off the stove, left the kitchen, and walked toward the living room. My phone dinged. Junie. Hey, Grandma, she said, voice light. We exchanged small pleasantries, her college app, my garden, the weather. Then, Mom said you've been making waves lately. That you're being difficult again. My hand froze on the lamp base. Difficult how? I asked, soft. She hesitated. The impression is, things are shifting. People feel torn. Her voice, usually warm, now carried distance. Is that really what you believe? I said. Do you believe that? A long pause. Then coldly. I think if this continues, no one's going to come for Christmas. She hung up before I could respond. The line went dead. In that moment, something inside snapped. I went to the bedroom closet. At the back, I found a box from last Christmas, never opened, stored among old sweaters. I lifted the lid. Inside was a photo frame and a card, signature from Brielle. Thanks for staying in your lane. We'll handle the rest. I felt that old weight, buried under years of coughing politeness, grace mistaken for weakness. I dropped the box into the fireplace. The wooden crate caught. Flames licked the edges. The frame's glass cracked. Smoke curled. I watched it burn. Tears came, not of despair, but release. Rage that had been silent too long. Moments passed, heavy and slow. Then, an unexpected knock. Silas. He stood in the doorway with a bakery bag. His presence was quiet. He didn't speak until he sat across from me at the kitchen table, the smell of warm cake between us. He gave no judgment, just offered quiet company. I took a bite. He watched. After a moment, I said, I thought I was being strong, that I was holding everything together. My voice broke, then steadied. But it feels like I was being erased. Silas nodded. Maybe strength isn't always holding the door open. Sometimes it's closing it. His words settled in the air between us. No fanfare, no demands, just a reminder that I had the power to draw the line. Later that night, I sat at my desk, pen in hand. I wrote a message to the family, short, firm, not pleading. I asked for an independent audit of the company and legal mediation. Nothing dramatic, just fact. Just boundary. I signed it, Camille May Thompson. The name I hadn't used in so long, now full and clear. I placed the letter in the Empire folder. I felt wind across the room, like a distant sigh. I glanced down at the kite handkerchief. It looked singed, just slightly. I picked it up. I stitched a thin golden thread along one edge, making the damage part of the design, not something to hide. I closed the drawer. The house was quiet, not empty, but changed. The envelope came certified, heavy stock paper. Brielle's legal counsel stamped across the corner like it was supposed to scare me. I opened it with a butter knife, steady hands, no rush, cease and desist. Allegations of meddling, defamation, and, my favorite, disrupting family assets. I read it once. Then again, this wasn't just a warning shot. This was a strategy. Discredit me before I could speak louder. The line that really landed was the one about questionable cognitive clarity given her age. That's when I realized I wasn't just a relative anymore. I was the threat. They wanted to paint me as forgetful, bitter, slipping. But I remembered everything, every shut door, every time I was left out of the room but somehow still expected to clean it afterward. I underlined the passive phrases, annotated the edges, then I placed the letter right under the stitched handkerchief on my desk. 2 days later, I drove out to Tulsa to meet Maxine, my old law school roommate. She'd retired 10 years ago, but she still read contracts like they owed her money. We sat in a quiet booth at a diner, pancakes between us and legal pads sprawled across the table. She read everything I brought, land deeds, board documents, the trust paperwork I'd almost forgotten about. Then she looked at me and said, "Camille, you've been slowly carved out of your own legacy." I swallowed hard. The phrase hit where I lived. Years ago, they had revised the family trust. Buried inside the amendments, clauses that shifted oversight, moved voting rights, reassigned assets, quietly. I should have known. I didn't. But now I did. Shame crawled up my spine, warm and bitter. But it didn't stay long. It hardened into resolve. They thought I wouldn't notice, I told her. Or worse, they thought I wouldn't fight. Maxine handed me her pen. Let's prove them wrong. The next morning, we filed a formal discovery request into the business's financials, a notarized affidavit from me outlining years of coercion, a demand for independent audit, no theatrics, just teeth. I also sent a separate letter to the board, names I'd known since my wedding day, friends of David. I laid out what I'd found, not opinion, documentation, discrepancies that would be impossible to explain away. At the bottom, I wrote, "You mistook my silence for submission. This is your correction." 3 days later, Brielle made her move. Public brunch, family invites, photos posted, captioned with "Unity through transparency." I knew what it was, a trap in a linen napkin, but I showed up anyway. They seated me at the end of the table, like I was just visiting. Smiles were wide, eyes sharper than butter knives. Brielle did her little speech about family strength, then turned the floor to me. I stood up, pulled out the folder from my bag, and passed it down the table. I thought it'd be better if everyone saw. I received the invitation in the mail, a glossed card embossed with Whitmore Legacy, an evening of honors. The phrase "hosting reconciliation" was tucked beneath in fine print. Brielle's choice of wording, as always, was calculated. I folded the card, slipped it into my purse, and stared out the window at the dusk settling over my street. The wind had changed. In a few hours, I'd walk into a gallery she'd rebuilt and call her bluff. The mansion's gallery wing was immaculate. Polished floors reflected chandeliers and ghost patterns. Walls lined with framed photos, children, founders, legacy names. I stepped inside with my dossier tucked under my arm, trying to appear as a guest, not a combatant. Guests greeted me politely as I passed. I caught a glimpse of one display. My portrait had been replaced by Brielle's sister, with the label Founder. I swallowed. They were erasing me in public. As the VIP guests gathered, I noticed movement behind the glass panel. The portrait label read, "Founding Mothers," listing Brielle and Evelyn. My name was conspicuously absent. A murmur rose in the crowd. A relative whispered, "Where's Camille?" A curator quickly handed out pamphlets attributing legacy to Brielle's genealogy, silent revisionism. I stepped forward, eyes fixed on the empty place. The electronic panel flickered. An image of me blinked on, then vanished, leaving only blank space. Someone gasped. "That's got to be a mistake," someone said. At the peak moment, Brielle ascended the stage, poised and radiant. She began her speech about continuing the legacy, how the gallery celebrated pioneer ancestors and honored vision. The crowd applauded. Then the lights dimmed, and she signaled a video. I pressed a hidden remote at my side. The screens behind her flickered to life, not her curated slides, but mine, footage of my charity work, architectural blueprints, speeches I made decades ago. Faces in the crowd stiffened. Brielle spun to stop the feed, but the backup generator I'd arranged kicked in. The presentation continued, layering proof over erasure. I heard her voice crack mid-sentence as the audience watched. My voice came over the speakers. I was never invisible, just unacknowledged. She bolted from the stage. I followed behind, backstage hallways dim, tension electrified. She confronted me near the exit. "You think a slideshow erases decades of control I've built?" Her voice trembled with rage. I held up the folder in my hand. "No, it just reminds everyone who built the foundation you're standing on." Her face twisted. She hissed threats, legal, relational, reputational. I remained calm. I arrived at the gallery just after twilight, the mansion's silhouette dark against the sky. I told myself I'd come merely to retrieve a packet of files, but every step forward felt like walking back into a trap. The gallery was silent, corridors dim. I expected lights, security hum. Instead, emptiness. As I entered the west wing, the side door I had locked earlier stood ajar. My breath caught. A door I knew should be sealed was broken open. My heels tapped the floor as I moved cautiously, eyes scanning exhibits that seemed subtly altered. Frames shifted, labels reattached, shadows stretched where none should be. I paused in front of a display. I'd handed that piece myself, and the placard no longer mentioned me. "If you break in my house, you're breaking in my memory, and memory has a defender," I told the darkness. In the media foyer, a large screen played the Whitmore Legacy loop. But when it reached my segment, the image went black, blank frames, no voice, no face. I approached the console, fingers hovering. I rewound the file, traced it to the archive, saw the original buried under renamed files. I clicked restore. Before I could finish, footsteps behind me. I spun. The screen snapped off. Darkness swallowed the foyer. But before the final image died, I saw timestamps, file names. I grabbed my flash drive, pushing out with the restored file. Upstairs, voices echoed. I followed to the balcony gallery. Junie stood with a guest, pointing at portraits. "Grandma isn't really here anymore. We're building new traditions now," she said. My chest tightened. Betrayal isn't always loud. I stepped forward. The room hushed. Guests turned. "New traditions start with truth. You forget me at your own risk," she faltered. The guests' eyes darted. Junie said nothing. I moved toward the safe room tucked behind the final exhibit. The door was unlocked. Inside, I found the drawer I had first opened. A cassette labeled Harlan Boone, final words caught my breath. The handwriting was unmistakable, David's. I placed it in the recorder and hit play. His voice filled the room, calm but firm. "If anyone dares override Camille May's authority, they stand against my foundation. She built alongside me, earning every name, every deed." That moment held weight heavier than any threat. I whispered, "You can't rewrite his voice to erase mine." I backed up the recording onto my flash drive, labeling it Truth. Evidence. Power. Lights flicked on through the gallery halls. Guests stirred. I made my way back to the main hall, portraits lining both sides, faces lit. I passed each frame with resolve, their eyes witnesses. At the entrance, Brielle appeared behind me, staring. The courthouse stood quiet against the pale morning light. Not silent, not empty, but quieter than I expected, given the storm we'd all just weathered. I walked up the stone steps, the heels of my boots clicking like punctuation. There were cameras, microphones, voices whispering. The headlines had caught wind. Heiress dispute turns ugly. Family legacy on trial. But I wasn't there to feed the story. I was there to end it. Inside, I spotted Brielle before she saw me. Front row, flanked by her lawyers, poised like the whole thing was beneath her. Same blazer she wore to David's funeral. She was playing that same role now, but her confidence didn't reach her eyes. When the judge asked for evidence, I didn't waste time. I walked up, handed over the flash drive, and waited as they connected it to the courtroom system. Then David's voice filled the room. If anyone ever questions Camille May's authority, they question me. She built this. Her name stays on it as long as mine does. A hush fell over the courtroom. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. Even Brielle's lead attorney looked like he'd swallowed something sharp. The judge asked if the file was verified. I said yes. I didn't need to explain more. His voice did the work for me. The ruling came down like a gavel to stone. Injunction denied. Sole rights returned to me. Gallery, studio, everything I had built, defended, and nearly lost. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. But something inside me unclenched. They weaponized my silence. I turned it into testimony. Outside, the wind had picked up. Reporters clustered near the sidewalk. One stepped forward and asked, "Do you feel vindicated, Ms. Boone?" I looked her square in the eye. "Vindication isn't loud," I said. "It's the sound of doors closing behind people who thought they'd locked you out." I saw Brielle push past the crowd, eyes forward, jaw tight. Junie followed behind her, slower, shoulders rounded, gaze fixed on the ground. I stood still and let them pass. I wasn't begging anymore. By noon, I was back at my new studio. It didn't smell like paint yet. It still smelled like drywall and fresh flooring. But it was mine. The windows were wide, the light honest. I unpacked a box labeled Tools and lined the brushes on the table. Then I peeled the wrap off a fresh canvas. No family trees. No Boone crest. No memorialized heirs. Just a blank space waiting for something real. I dipped the brush, pressed it to the surface. A figure took shape, solitary, mid-step, walking away from a burning tree. Sometimes we don't need them to come back. We just need to know we survived. Hours passed. I lost track of time in the strokes. Then, 3 slow knocks on the studio door. I wiped my hands and opened it. Junie stood there. She wasn't crying. She wasn't apologizing either. Just holding something close to her chest, a worn photo album with a cracked spine. She looked up. "Can I watch you paint?" I held the door open. She walked in. She didn't explain. I didn't ask. She sat near the window, flipping through old pages. I went back to the canvas. The room filled with quiet. Only the gentle sound of bristles against cloth. We didn't rebuild the past. We built something else. Something unspoken. Something possible. By evening, the painting was done. I stood back and let the silence settle over it. A small camera was set up on the shelf. I turned it on. "This isn't a story of revenge," I said to the lens. "It's a story of remembering who you are when they try to forget you."